The Senate will come to order. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores, Gutierrez, Hall, Hancock, Hinojosa, Huffman, Hughes, Johnson, King, Colcourse, La Mantilla, Menendez, Middleton, Miles, Nichols, Parker, Paxton, Perry, Schwertner, Sparks, Springer, West, Whitmire, Zaffarini.
Quorum is present. Please rise for the invocation to be delivered by Pastor Waylon Lee of Vox Vineyard Church in Austin.
I invite us to pause and make space for the divine in this moment. Please pray with me. God, our Creator and divine mystery, we are gathered as public servants to discern what it means to serve each person in this state of Texas. Invite us toward a posture of humility that reminds us of our shared humanity and needs. Imprint on our minds and hearts the invitation to protect and care for the most vulnerable and marginalized. May the conversations and decisions that take place in this room not be driven by fear, shame, or othering, but may the words and actions on this floor be guided by empathy, compassion, and mutuality. May we learn to sit in the discomfort of silence long enough to truly listen, to be less reactive, and to grow in our understanding of every fellow Texan. We ask all this through God our Creator, God our Healer, and God our breath of life. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Lee. The Dean of the Senate moves to dispense of the reading of yesterday's journal. Is there an objection? Chair hears none. The motion's adopted. The following message from the governor. The Secretary will read the message.
To the Senate of the 88th Legislature regular session, I ask the advice, consent, and confirmation of the Senate to the following appointments: to be a member of the Executive Council of Physical Therapy and Occupational Therapy Examiners, Mano Mahadeva Frisco; to be a member of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, Said Javed Anwar Midland. Respectfully submitted, Greg Abbott, Governor of Texas, to nominations.
Members, that concludes the morning call. Senator Campbell, you're recognized for a motion to suspend the regular order of business to take and consider Senate Bill 240.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. There is a nursing shortage, and it's made worse by workplace violence. SB 2040, excuse me, SB 20, okay, I'm going to try again. SB 240, I just wanted to get everybody's attention. Senate Bill 240 will require health care facilities to, 1, establish a workplace violence prevention committee tasked with creating and implementing a violence prevention plan and policy. 2, protect an employee's right to report incidences without fear of retaliation. And 3, provide post-incident services such as medical services for victims of violence if needed. And with that, members, I think that's it.
Senator Campbell moves suspension of regular order of business on Senate Bill 240. Is there an objection? The chair hears none. The rules are suspended. The chair lays out on second reading Senate Bill 240. The secretary will read the caption.
Senate Bill 240 relating to workplace violence prevention in certain health facilities.
Senator Campbell, you're recognized for a motion.
I move passage to engrossment.
Senator Campbell moves passage to engrossment. Is there an objection? The chair hears none. Senate Bill 240 is passed to engrossment. Senator Campbell, you're now recognized for a motion to suspend the constitutional 3-day rule.
So moved.
Senator Campbell moves suspension of the 3-day rule. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores, Lucas.
There being 31 ayes and no nays, the 3-day rule is suspended. The chair now lays out on third reading and final passage Senate Bill 240. The secretary will read the caption.
Senate Bill 240 relating to workplace violence prevention in certain health facilities.
Senator Campbell, you recognized for a motion.
I move final passage of 240.
Senator Campbell moves final passage of Senate Bill 240. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores.
There being 31 ayes and no nays, Senate Bill 240 is finally passed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members.
Senator Kokhorst, you're recognized for a motion to suspend the regular order of business on committee substitute Senate Bill 24.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I move to suspend the Senate's regular order of business and take up and consider at this time committee substitute to Senate Bill 24. Members, Senate Bill 24, the Thriving Texas Family Act promotes a culture of life for Texas families and mothers. The bill amends the Texas Family Code and Texas Human Resource Code to consolidate maternal and family support services and these programs, including PEI, the PEI division of the Department of State, the Department of Family and Protective Services, to the Family Health Services Division of HHSC. Additionally, the bill codifies the current, what we call Alternatives to Abortion, or A2A program, and renames it the Texas Pregnancy and Parenting Support Network to promote healthy pregnancy and childbirth and family formation and family self-sufficiency. Texas programs that offer services during pregnancy and childhood currently are siloed within various Texas state agencies. Many are serving the same population and drawing on benefit programs at HHSC. These services must be better coordinated to ensure needed services to women and families to promote stability and set families on a path for success. CSSB 24 realigns these programs as family support services to allow HHSC to better coordinate home visiting programs such as nurse-family partnership alongside current maternal and childhood services offered to pregnant women and mothers with young children, including those that have been in alternatives to abortion. This program will reduce duplication of efforts and ensure development of strong continuum of support for families of all types. It also will increase performance outcomes and data tracking for these programs to help inform better investments, members. And some of the changes made from within are to work with our local communities and let many nonprofits enter into this space to provide better for these families, both men and women, as they raise our children in Texas. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will take any questions or move to suspend the regular order of business.
Senator Menendez, for what purpose?
We can roll with it. Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, would Senator Kolkhorst yield for some questions?
Senator Kolkhorst, you yield?
Oh, yes.
Senator Kolkhorst, I appreciate the work you've done over the years, and it is my understanding in your bill you're trying to consolidate some family support programs to the Family Support Services Division within HHSE. My concern is that not all of the programs are going to be kept intact in this move, and as you and I have discussed, I have an amendment that would help some of those programs that were left out, and so I believe that you're open to making this, I think, this correction improvement to your bill.
It definitely is, and we appreciate working together. Senator, you and I have worked on these issues for years, starting in the House way back when and now. And so I know we were going to do this bill last Thursday, but we didn't quite get to it on intent. And I think that your amendment is perfect. I caught that late in a drafting era, and so thank you for bringing it to our attention.
And my only other point, and you've addressed it, I have a concern about the evidence base, but you had a response for why you've removed evidence base from the funding. Yeah,
I think it's a great question, and not something that we didn't debate back and forth as we were crafting this bill. As currently where PEI is housed in the family code, and we're moving it more in to a code to the human resources where all Medicaid is. One of the things that when you go back and you read, and over the years developed, some great practices, but 75% of those programs had to be evidence-based. And you know this, evidence-based is something that you have to really work to get that stamp of approval. As I've worked with different groups, I think that there's a lot of really good work going on in our communities that have been crowded out of that space. Now, there is about $18 million that's attached to federal monies that'll stay 75-25. Okay. And so I think that we're not wiping out all of that, and that's the McV money, the maternal infant early childhood visiting or visitation, as I call it, and so that will still apply. But the one thing that I can say, Senator, as drafted, Senate Bill 24 doesn't say that you can't use evidence base. It just doesn't have that requirement that 75% of this funding has to be evidence-based. And again, I think that we're going to find that there are communities that are doing excellent work. We have some language in there that I think gives some religious protections that are going to allow some people to compete for these dollars. And as you know, the alternatives to abortion, we're renaming post-Dobbs, and it's going to be more wraparound services for those mothers giving birth, and to work even with adoption agencies, and there's a lot of good things. So the bill is kind of twofold. It takes the PEI and it moves it over to a new code and to a new agency, and then the A2A we rename. We codify what has been in a rider for several years now. And that money has grown substantially. We just adopted today $140 million. And so it's going to be a one-stop shop and we often refer this as mothers, but in this bill, we actually say fathers too. Right. And so, and we all know how important fathers are to raising these children. So I'm super excited about what we could do in opening these programs up and allowing people to enter in and to vie for these contracts and serve our local communities.
Very good. So would the bill prevent institutions of higher education from conducting efficacy reviews of prevention and early intervention programs that haven't been evaluated? Because I think this was part that may have been removed.
Yeah. So those are the interagency contracts, and I did strike that from the code. It does not prevent that. It doesn't say to HHSC, you can't do that. What it says right now is that it was pretty directive in the code currently. And so it gives flexibility to HHSC, again, as, we move into this post-Dobbs era and with alternatives to abortion becoming more focused on the families. So no prevention of it, but it doesn't require like currently stated in the statute.
It sounds like you're trying to add some flexibility.
I think it's important. These dollars have grown, Senator Menendez, to a huge level. And let me just say this. You're from Bexar County. Gosh, anybody listening, there's not a better advocate than the Bexar County delegation. I just saw that in Article 2. My goodness, y'all are organized and y'all do have a lot of requests. But you know how y'all germinate things in Bexar County for the homeless. You do all kind of different things for those that have drug addictions. And I'm just going to tell you, when we open this up, I can't imagine what Bexar County is going to do and probably set the pace for the rest of the state. And so, I put that out as a challenge for everybody to say that these are important programs. It began with Senator West in a Senate bill way back in I believe it was 99 or 97. And after some federal legislation had passed, he is so wonderful. I work with him on kinship and different programs. And so you can tell my excitement about this bill and what I think it can foster in the future in helping people that struggle at the beginnings of maybe not just their first child, but they have many children.
Right.
And how do we keep them out of the juvenile justice system? How do we keep them out of the child welfare system? How do we set them on a path to hopefully self-sufficiency, great outcomes in schools, going on to higher education, and change their life? And so, it's not been easy, Senator Menendez. I have challenged my staff. I mean, we have gone over and over and over. I literally have read every word of this bill several times. And, I go, okay, why is this? And we tweak it. Why is that? And so I think it's a good start to a new beginning.
And I appreciate all the hard work. And I guess the last clarifying point, so you did write it so carefully to where we don't risk the federal funds, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is our understanding. And also, I think moving it to this new code where Medicaid is housed, moving from the family code to the human resources code, working with the agencies, as well as working with Ledge Council, I think there's some opportunity there.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking my questions. Thank you, Mr. President, members.
Yes, thank you, Senator Menendez. The Dean of the Senate moves to excuse Senator West due to death in the family. Is there an objection? The chair hears none. The motion's adopted. Senator Johnson, for what purpose?
Questions of the author?
Senator Kolkhorst, do you yield?
Yes, most certainly.
Senator Kolkhorst, you and I discussed last week, and I already have some notes regarding this question. But I do want to discuss it a little bit. It's referring to the bill, page 12, line 28 and 29, which hold that the commission or network contractors may not provide family planning services through the network. And I have some notes as to what that might be, but I'll first ask you to give me your understanding of why that prohibition is contained in the bill.
And I'm on page 12 of the substitute, and what line?
I'm sorry, I don't have the sub in front of me. This is the prohibition on provision of family planning services by network contractors.
Sure. The beginnings of this bill, Senator, and thank you for your question. The beginnings of this bill, of course, took the rider that had been in several bill patterns of the General Appropriations Act through the years and codified much of that. It wasn't identical, but it codified much of that. And so that part of what you're referring to, contracts in A2A do not allow contractors to provide family planning services. But, interestingly, providers may refer to those services. The bill just codifies the current requirement. So it lifted that language out of the bill, the GAA, and put it into code.
So as I understand this is not some new gotcha, and I can appreciate that. In fact, there are some referrals going on. It nevertheless strikes me as a shortcoming in the bill. Don't know where we'll wind up at the end of the session, because we do have entities that could contract to be providers under this that do provide family planning services. And in Texas, in particular, we have a real problem with repeat pregnancies, repeat unwanted pregnancies, and repeat teen pregnancies. And so somebody who is in a crisis, who is visiting a pregnancy crisis center, is now going to be referred to another entity and may be less likely to receive services. So I wonder if you would consider changing the pre-existing set of requirements to allow for family planning services to be part of the conversation here.
I think it still is a part of the conversation. I would respectfully oppose your idea or amendment just because, again, heavily debated through the years in the General Appropriations Act. As you can understand, the sensitivity on that particular issue. But again, the bill does not allow contractors to provide family planning services, but providers may refer for those services and do under the current statute, or not statute, the language in a rider in the General Appropriations Act.
It's a worthy conversation, and I appreciate about 20% of the time. I'll continue to think it's a defect, but it won't be the first time I lose, so we can continue. Another concern I have with the bill is that we're dealing in many cases with unlicensed medical professionals. We're dealing with private entities. They may or may not have religious affiliations. They may or may not have certain views that would encourage them to exclude certain people. And there's a set of performance requirements that are troubling, I think. I'm sorry, I'm not the bill's substitute, but there's a list of performance outcomes. And one of the criteria for evaluating the efficacy of service providers is how they do with a list of these categories: improving healthy pregnancy and childbirth, terrific; improving child health and psychological development, terrific; assisting families, great; workforce participation, also good; long-term reliance on state and federal. Okay, now we start moving into areas that I think we all desire that people who are needing assistance can get off assistance. We all desire that there be a family home life. And then we get to that next requirement of promoting marriage and family formation for participating parents. Now, there's all kinds of data suggesting that marriage, and there's cultural norms, and I share them, that marriage is a good way to raise kids. But in the case of a pregnancy crisis center, where the woman visiting the center might be the victim of spousal abuse, and we have a whole program that's encouraging marriage, that strikes me as creating problems and also kind of making lifestyle judgments that the state ought to not be making. Don't you think?
Well, this is where you and I are going to differ, and I have great confidence in our providers that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Obviously, if a woman presents and comes into that situation and tells her life story, I have great faith in our contractors to know when it is proper to promote a family lifestyle versus not. And so, you and I can both go into long statistics about children being supported by a mother and a father and their outcomes in life. And so it's just, something I'm pretty passionate about.
And Senator Kolkhorst, you and I would probably agree about most of those concepts. Where I get nervous is when it's in a statute. And unlike you, I don't necessarily trust these entities. They're not licensed medical professionals. We have experiences with entities under this program in the past where you had all kinds of problems, legal problems, sham entities thrown up, and I don't see a whole lot of oversight in the bill. So I am concerned that we may have a lot of unqualified finger wagging going on by people who really don't know what they're doing, and we're giving them state money and encouraging them to berate some woman who's in crisis. I'm just not comfortable with that.
That's certainly not how I read it. I respect that that's how you read it. I think that Senate Bill 24 is fairly robust in new reporting data that we haven't had before. And so I would respectfully disagree.
Okay. Thank you for taking my question, Senator Kolkhorst.
Thank you, Senator.
Members, the motion is on suspension. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Bencourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores.
23 ayes, 7 nays. The rules are suspended. Chair lays out on second reading. Committee substitute for Senate Bill 24. Secretary, read the caption.
Committee substitute, Senate Bill 24, relating to the powers and duties of the Health and Human Services Commission.
There is an amendment. The Secretary will read the amendment.
Floor amendment number 1 by Menendez.
You recognize, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is, members, this is the amendment Senator Kolkhorst and I were discussing earlier, where there was, in her words, possibly a drafting error. We saw this, and we know that in her leadership and her commitment to Texas families, she did not want to avoid or have these programs not avoid migration. And so these programs are going to be fully migrated to HHSC as the bill appears to unintentionally exclude some important programs. A few examples of the programs left out: Family Youth and Success, Texas Service Members, Veterans and Families, Texas Parent Helpline, prevention campaigns. And so this amendment simply ensures that all the programs remain intact in their move to HHSC. Senator Kolkhorst and I had a conversation about it earlier. And Mr. President and members, I do believe that this amendment remains acceptable to the author.
Senator Kolkhorst on the amendment.
Yes, I want to thank my colleague and friend. Many years of working on these situations and catching this error, and it is acceptable.
Any objection? Hearing none. Amendment is adopted. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
You are recognized on passage to engrossment.
So moved, Mr. President.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores, Gutierrez, Hall, Hancock, Hinojosa, Huffman, Hughes, Johnson, King, Kolkhorst, LaMantia, Menendez, Middleton, Miles, Nichols, Parker, Paxton, Perry, Shortner, Sparks, Springer, West, Whitmire, and Zaffarini.
There being 22 ayes and 8 no votes, we'll hold there.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Bill passes to engrossment. Senator Kolkhorst, you found 2 friends. You're recognized on suspension of the constitutional 3-day rule.
Thank you, Mr. President. So moved.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart.
25 ayes and 5 nays. The rules are suspended. Chair lays out on third reading and final passage. Committee substitute for Senate Bill 24. Secretary, read the caption.
Committee substitute, Senate Bill 24, relating to the powers and duties of the Health and Human Services Commission.
You're recognized on final.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move final passage of committee substitute to Senate Bill 24.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell.
23 ayes and 7 nays. The bill is finally passed. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for making this a priority bill. I appreciate the support of all of our members and the good discussion today.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Birdwell, you're recognized to suspend the regular order of business on SJR 35.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I move to suspend the Senate's regular order of business, take up and consider SJR 35. Members, in 1996, the United States Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act that made it unlawful for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Further outlined in the act passed in 1996, it states that aliens are authorized to vote for such other purpose under state constitution or statute or a local ordinance. Currently, Texas has statutory citizenship requirements for voting in Texas. statutory, not constitutional. Thus, there is no enabling language required for this legislation. Under Section 11 of the Election Code, a qualified voter is eligible to vote, and an individual must be a United States citizen to be a qualified voter. SJR 35 proposes a constitutional amendment that affirms that non-citizens of the United States may not vote in any election within the state of Texas. I move suspension, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Rules are suspended. Chair lays out on second reading SJR 35. Secretary, read the caption.
SJR 35, proposing a constitutional amendment clarifying that a voter must be a United States citizen.
You're recognized on
Move
passage
passage.
to engrossment.
Move passage to engrossment, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Bill passed to engrossment. You're recognized to amend the constitutional 3-day rule.
So moved, Mr. President.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton.
29 ayes, 1 no vote. The rules are suspended. Chair lays out third reading and final passage. SJR 35. Secretary, read the caption.
SJR 35, proposing a constitutional amendment clarifying that a voter must be a United States citizen.
You're recognized on final passage.
Move final passage, Mr. President.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco.
29 ayes, 1 nay. The bill is finally passed. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, Mr. President and members. Is that one? Yeah, okay. Yeah. That way there's nothing like getting on early. Bob, I've had the same problem.
Senator Whitmire, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr.
Suspend the
President.
regular order of business on committee substitute for Senate Bill 736.
Thank you, sir. I move to suspend Senate regular order of business to take up and consider Senate Bill 736. Members, since 2003, when voters approved collective bargaining, Houston firefighters worked under a collective bargaining agreement. Until 2017, the collective bargaining agreement was successfully renegotiated every 3 years by the mayor and firefighters. Unfortunately, since 2017, firefighters have worked without a contract because firefighters in the city have been unable to reach an agreement. Senate Bill 736 requires the city and the firefighters union to have a mandatory arbitration to mediate any issues that may arise and cannot be resolved between the two parties. That agreement can no longer last than 1 year. 736 amends the local government code by adding that if the parties cannot agree, both parties go to arbitration. One arbitrator is chosen by the city, one is chosen by firefighters, and the third is mutually agreed to. Members, since 2017, Houston is down more than 400 firefighters, while demand for fire and emergency medical service has doubled. Houston ended 2022 with 3,644 firefighters, the lowest in 20 years. Houston firefighters put their lives on the line every day and are vital to the safety of the citizens of Houston. The Houston Firefighters Department is at a breaking point, and it is past time for the city to come to the table and negotiate a new contract for our dedicated firefighters. Members, last week on this Senate floor, we honored the state firefighters. We honored firefighters from across this state, and we told them repeatedly, we will not forget you. That is the reason for me bringing Senate Bill 736 to this Senate floor, to tell the Houston firefighters that we will not forget them and hold the city to what the wishes and the voters of Houston desire. I so move suspension, Mr. President.
Senator Alvarado, what purpose?
Author, question.
Do you yield?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Dean Whitmire, you and I have been strong advocates for our firefighters back home. My time on city council, working with Local 341, working with the rank and file members. For those folks that say, well, can't we deal with this issue back home? How's this going to be different? What assurances can you give folks that by changing the process up, that everybody's going to have a fair shot?
Thank you for your question. It has to be an urgent matter for me to bring a local issue to the Senate floor. Bob Lanier showed us in 2003 that we can do our business at home and build a consensus. But to negotiate, Senator Alvarado, it takes two parties. The firefighters are prepared. They've requested the city to meet and discuss and negotiate with them, but the city has completely ignored them. It's disrespectful, it's unsafe, and it does not honor the Houston voters, and only because of the urgency of the matter would I bring it to the Senate floor today. Thank you for your support.
Members, the motion is on the suspension of the regular order of business. Any objection? Hearing none. Rules are suspended. Chair lays out on second reading. Committee substitute for Senate Bill 736. Secretary, read the caption.
Committee substitute Senate Bill 736 relating to mandatory arbitration for certain municipal fire departments and employee bargaining agents.
You recognize on passage to engrossment.
I move passage Senate Bill 736 to engrossment.
Any objection? Hearing none. Bill passed to engrossment. You recognize to suspend the constitutional 3-day rule.
Suspend the constitutional rule that bills be read on 3 several days.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Bettencourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell.
29 ayes, no nays. The rules are suspended.
Thank you.
Chair now lays out third reading and final passage.
I move final passage.
Hold on. Committee substitute for, I know you want to get out of here quickly, but committee substitute for Senate Bill 736. Secretary, read the caption.
Committee substitute Senate Bill 736 relating to mandatory arbitration for certain municipal fire departments and employee bargaining agents.
Now you recognize the final passage.
I move final passage Senate Bill 736.
Secretary, call the roll.
Alvarado, Bettencourt, Birdwell.
29 ayes and no nays. The bill is finally passed. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. And on behalf of the firefighters, people of Houston, we thank you.
It's a good bill. Thank you.
Body.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Senator LaMantia, you're recognized to introduce the doctor of the day.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, it's an honor to stand before you in recognizing my constituent, Dr. Martha Cano, who will be serving as our physician of the day. Dr. Cano is a board-certified family physician with South Texas Health Systems Clinics. She graduated from Harlingen High School and has been a lifelong resident of Harlingen, Texas. Dr. Cano received a bachelor's degree in biology and chemistry from the University of Texas Pan American and her medical doctorate degree from the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. She completed her family residency at Christus Spohn Memorial Hospital in Corpus Christi, where she served as chief resident. Dr. Cano has been providing medical care to Valley residents for over 17 years and also serves on the governing board of the South Texas Health Systems. She's an active member of the Texas Academy of Family Physicians and has served as a delegate for their Valley chapter. Thank you, Dr. Cano, for your service to our capital community and for sharing your experience and knowledge on the future of medicine. Thank you for taking care of us today. Mr. President and members, please help me in welcoming Dr. Martha Cano to the Senate and for serving as our physician of the day.
Senator Paxton, you're recognized on committee substitute for Senate Bill 796.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend the regular order of business and the intent calendar rule to take up and consider Senate Bill 796.
Members, is there objection? Hearing none. Rules are suspended. Chair lays out on second reading. Committee substitute for Senate Bill 796. The Secretary will read the caption.
Committee substitute Senate Bill 796 relating to arbitration provisions in surplus lines insurance contracts.
I think Senator Paxton needs help on the bill. Is that Senator Middleton? For what purpose? No shouting is allowed, and that button won't work if it's not plugged in. And under Senate rules, you're not allowed to use another desk. I think you're in a bad spot. Senator Betancourt, what purpose?
Well, I was going to attempt, Mr. President, to ask questions of the author, but I'm not sure that's possible at this point.
Let me speak to the parliamentarian to see if he's allowed to move to another desk.
Okay.
Did any of his freshmen know how to help him? They're all worried about themselves. They're not looking out for him right now. Maybe you could ask Senator Paxton, since she introduced the bill.
Mr. President?
Yes. Yes. What purpose?
To ask a question of the author?
Or you're willing to share your mic so he can answer?
I am not.
You're not? Okay. Well, then you can ask the question. He can't answer.
Do you have nothing to say? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Mr. President?
Yes, Senator Betancourt.
I'm not sure with a freshman that is to be seen and not heard. Ta-da! Let's try that again. With a freshman that's to be seen and not heard. Ta-da! I'm not sure how we're going to proceed.
Senator Perry, what purpose?
As protocol, we don't walk between a bill author and the speak, but since he's not technically the author, is it okay for me to drop that green card up there?
Yes, it is. Okay. Yes, it is. Yeah. Did you have to pay the rent on his cord? Is that it? Senator Middleton, did you not realize there's a monthly fee for that usage of the microphone? Have you paid it since you've been here? Yes. I take a loan. Senator Swertner.
Thank you, Mr. President. Permission to ask questions of the author?
You have permission to ask questions. Is his microphone working yet? The Sergeant of Arms, do we have a wireless mic available? You could bring him a wireless mic if you'd like, since there are 5 other senators who can't figure this out either. You know, in my 16 years here, I've never seen anyone use a wireless mic. This is unprecedented.
Oh, wow.
Do you yield for a question from Senator?
I do yield. I do yield. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm looking here at a bill booklet about surplus lines and arbitration provisions. And it's a well laid out bill booklet. I was wondering, sir, what are surplus lines?
So surplus lines are types of insurance that the typical insurance market will not cover. It's specialty lines of insurance.
There are a number of different bullet points about what does surplus lines cover and how do you buy them. Do you remember those bullet points in your bill layout?
I'll tell you one of them that's not on there is losing a bill book.
That's true, Senator. And this bill, though, sir, what exactly would it do?
So what this bill would do is it would require that our arbitration provisions in the state of Texas for surplus lines of insurance have to be arbitrated in Texas under Texas law and no longer out of state law like New York law.
Are we not part of a union?
We are one of the 50 states.
Do you have problems with New York, the state of New York?
Well, all this bill does is it says, don't New York our Texas arbitration laws.
Any other states that do this?
I'm not aware.
Not aware, Senator. This is your bill and your idea, unless it's, I'm looking here at the very back of the bill booklet, an email from Craig Island. Did you get this idea from Craig Island?
No, I actually got the idea from some constituents that had windstorm issues after windstorms and hurricanes and had to go arbitrate in the state of New York, which is not anything like the great state of Texas.
That's right. I would agree with that, Senator. Well, I would hold on to your bill booklets from now on. I appreciate you donating it to me on my desk here, but it's not necessary. You can have it back whenever you'd like it. I'll bring it back to you if you'd like.
I'll need to get insurance on that first.
Thank you, Senator. Welcome to the Senate.
Senator Menendez, what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. President. Questions of the author?
Excuse me, Senator, you can't leave your desk. I mean, I know you have a wireless mic. You can't roam the floor. You're not a game show host here. Do you yield?
I do yield, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Milton. Senator, all good fun aside, this is a very serious bill. In committee, is it not true that we heard from business people, homeowners, if I'm not mistaken, possibly even school districts who did not realize there was a tiny arbitration clause in their insurance? When they had a claim, they were told, sorry, see you in New York. Is that not accurate?
That is 100% accurate.
And so people who are just bought insurance in good faith and paid their premiums, and when they needed help, they were told either take our lowball offer or we'll see you at your expense in arbitration in New York City. And all you're trying to say is if you sold and the property, the insurance is here in Texas, we should be able to conduct the business in Texas. Is that correct?
That's right. It's got to be arbitrated in Texas under Texas laws.
I think you have a good bill. Thank you. Congratulations. Welcome to the Senate.
Senator. Thank you.
It's also a first, a serious question on a freshman bill that he's being hazed on as his first bill. So there's two things have happened today. Senator Alvarado, what purpose?
To ask the author a question.
Do you yield?
I do yield. Thank you.
Oh, neighbor. We're neighbors. We sit next to each other, but we're also neighbors in our district, right?
That's right.
You represent the city of Galveston?
That's right.
Do you remember session before last? I was actually carrying a bill for the city of Galveston.
I think I recall that.
Uh-huh. Somehow it died over there in the House.
It did not work out from what I remember.
You know who killed that bill?
I do not recall.
I remember who killed it. I'm staring right at him. And now you want to sit by me and you want to be chummy with me, and I don't know. I've really got to think long and hard about this. And you're turning red. Now, you're not tanning someplace. Are you going to the same tan salon that Tan Parker goes to?
I hope not. No. I hope not. No.
So do you remember that? I mean, we can talk through that.
I do recall that bill with Chairman Angie Chin Button. Yes, I do.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it was for the city of Galveston, who you represent. Well, not the government entity, but the jurisdiction.
That bill went about as well as it sounds like this one is going right now. So,
yeah. Well, I'm going to think long and hard about this, how I vote on your bill, considering that you killed my bill over there. So I haven't forgotten that. So we may need to, negotiate some things. Maybe build a wall right here.
I can.
Is this your bill?
Yes.
Okay. Now tell me what it does.
So Senate Bill 7, committee substitute to Senate Bill 796, just requires that under surplus lines of insurance that arbitration must occur in the state of Texas, and also it must be under Texas law.
Okay. Well, it sounds pretty simple. Well, we'll see. I'm still trying to get over, that loss. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Lowe's knows what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Another unprecedented first here of a senator confronting another senator who came from the House who killed their bill in the last session. That's a classic. And you didn't ask to move your desk. That's amazing to me. You're living in borrowed time here, Senator Middleton. Senator Hughes, what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the gentleman yield for some questions?
Would you yield?
I do yield. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Middleton, would you agree with me that the committee process is very important in legislative matters?
Very important. Very important. Thank you, Chairman.
What committee did this bill go through, if you recall?
It went through the Committee on Business and Commerce by Chairman Schwartner.
How many members are on that committee?
That's a good question, actually.
Can you tell us what the committee vote was on this bill when it came through the committee?
The committee vote was unanimous.
So when you say unanimous, do you mean everyone voted yes or no one voted no?
Nobody voted no.
So was everyone there for the hearing?
I don't believe so, actually. I recall some empty chairs.
Did you try to bring up your bill when members were absent so they couldn't be there to ask questions and participate in the process?
I don't recall that happening, although I did just hear from Senator Menendez, who co-authored the bill.
Senator, you're obviously passionate about your bill, and you've handled it very well without the use of your bill book. Would you agree with the Senate, would you agree with us that for the rest of the session, you'll present all your bills from memory without the use of your bill book like you have today?
I don't know if I can ensure that risk.
I don't know if that would probably be a surplus line if you were trying to get something like that.
That would definitely be a surplus line.
Senator Mill, thanks for this bill. Thanks for knowing your bill so well and for answering my questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Springer, what purpose?
To ask the freshman some questions.
Do you yield?
I do yield.
Is there any other states that we should be concerned about other than New York that you've failed to address with the other 48 states?
This does occur in Tennessee as well.
Okay. But New York's the biggest one, right?
New York's the biggest one.
So should we call this the Pace-Bacani Act? Would that work?
I like it.
Okay. Mr. President, since he's changing the bill, I move to postpone consideration of Senate Bill 796 until 11 a.m. on Wednesday, March 29th.
Any objection? Hearing none? The bill is postponed. Did you kill one of his bills too?
Nay.
Oh, by the way, you can return that mic back. Not to us. Back there. Yeah. For those of you in the gallery or watching online, we always haze our freshman senators on the very first bill they pass a little bit. Give them a little bit of a hard time. Yes? You won't be able to speak the rest of the day. Senator Hancock, what purpose?
To make a point, Mr. President.
You're recognized to make a point.
I would like to point out that when we have our one engineer off the floor, there aren't enough senators to put a mic back together again.
Yes, yes. Senator Hughes, you're recognized on Senate Bill 921. Suspend the regular order of business. We're back to serious business.
Thank you, Mr. President. And members, I move suspension of the Senate's regular order of business to take up and consider at this time Senate Bill 921. By now, I suspect most of us have heard of ranked choice voting. Some may be very familiar with it. Others may be a little fuzzy. Let me walk just briefly through how it works, because that's what this bill is about. Ranked choice voting is a confusing election reform, so-called. It's being pushed in mostly large cities, but also some states have adopted it, and it fundamentally changes the election process. And evidence shows it has the effect of disenfranchising voters and allows marginal candidates that are not supported by a majority of the voters to win elections. I want to stress that. Marginal candidates that do not have a support of the majority of voters get elected under ranked choice voting in many cases. As of December of last year, 64 American jurisdictions have this in place, covering about 13 million voters. That includes 2 states, 2 counties, and 60 cities. Now, back in 2001, Honorable Henry Cuellar, who was then our Secretary of State, issued an election law opinion saying that ranked choice voting is illegal in Texas. And we believe he's right. But as you know, the Secretary of State's election law opinion does not have the force of law. And so we want to nip this in the bud before it takes root in Texas. So with ranked choice voting, the voter is asked to rank every candidate in a race from his number 1 choice to his last choice. For example, in a race with 5 candidates, a voter is asked to rank the candidates from 1 through 5, the candidate ranked as number 1 being the voter's first choice, number 5 being the voter's last choice. If no candidate wins a majority of the voters of the tabulation of ballots for the number 1 spot, then the candidate with the fewest number of votes is eliminated, and the folks who selected them as their number 1 choice have those votes changed to the second choice, and they tabulate again. And if no one has a majority of number 1 votes, the last place candidate's taken off again, and the tabulation takes place again. And so this continues until one of the remaining candidates achieves a majority. But as you can imagine, in many cases, that candidate may have been the second, third, fourth, or even last choice of the majority of voters, meaning the candidate could win who was not the first choice of a majority of the voters. Just a couple of examples. In last year in Alameda County, California, officials admitted 2 months after a school board election. So that the school board election takes place using ranked choice voting. 2 months after the election, they admitted they had miscounted the votes and had certified the wrong candidate as the winner. It's interesting, the election officials didn't even notice because this process is so complicated. An outside group ran the numbers and flagged the issue, and the election officials agreed we picked the wrong candidate. In 2021, in the New York mayor's race, it took 8 rounds of vote counting of the 10 candidates over a 2-week period before a final winner was announced. And by the time they got to the 8th round, the ballots of more than 140,000 voters had been thrown out because they did not completely rank all the candidates. So think about that. Many times when candidates go in for ranked choice voting and they're told, rank these candidates 1 through 5, however many there are, the evidence shows that at least a third of voters will normally pick only one candidate. I don't want to rank all 5. I don't know all 5. I know that guy, that girl. I'm going to pick that one. That's my number 1 choice. Well, if you do that, if you pick just one and don't go all the way down the list, then when that candidate is knocked out of the balloting, your votes don't count in subsequent rounds. And that happened again in the New York City mayor's race in 2021. 140,000 voters had their votes thrown out just because they didn't go all the way down. In fact, evidence shows that, again, almost a third of candidates do not choose more than just one. And so if a voter fails to do that, their vote doesn't count in the process. We understand this. Ultimately, the winner is often not the choice of a majority of the voters who participated. The RCV majority winner may be the first, second, third, or last choice. And that's only of those voters who counted all the way down, whose votes made it all the way through the process. So like with so many other so-called reforms, this is mostly taking root at the city level. We want to stop it before it gets any further in Texas. So what the bill does, I do have an amendment that will clarify this would apply to all elections, general and primary. And I thank you for the lengthy layout, and I move suspension of the Senate's regular order of business.
Senator Eckhart, what purpose?
To ask one question to the author.
She said one.
Of course I'll yield. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Hughes. Is there anywhere in the state of Texas where ranked choice voting is currently utilized in elections?
Thankfully, none that I'm aware of.
And so the current state of the law is it is not legal whether or not your bill passes.
Well, the law doesn't say you can't do it. It doesn't say you can. So we want to make it say you can't.
Thank you.
No, thank you for your questions.
Senator Hinojosa, what purpose?
Well, Senator Hughes, yield?
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Senator Hughes, I think you answered one of my questions that Senator Eckhart asked. But I guess under preferential voting, you can come in second and still not be, somebody comes in third can become a candidate in a runoff.
That's right.
So that means that you could elect people who don't get the majority vote.
Well, Citra, I would say that the difference is when we have a runoff election, people get to come vote. You know, with ranked choice voting, you vote only one time. I think that would be the main difference, because with ranked choice voting, there is no runoff. You only get to vote once. And if you don't rank all the candidates, your vote doesn't count.
And one more point that I got my attention. I guess there was an election in California where they had to vote 3 or 4, 5, 6 times.
That's right. They had to go through all those different rounds before they finally got to someone who had the majority of the votes that were left. That's exactly right. It was a real mess.
I guess they tried to wear out the voters.
I think that's exactly right. I think you're.
Thank you, Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Senator Hinojosa.
Senator Menendez, what purpose? He said, do you yield? And he'll have his mic ready in a moment.
I yield, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. So thank you, Senator Hughes. Senator Hughes, this is about ranked choice voting, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do we have ranked choice voting in Texas?
A number of bills have been filed to bring it into the city level. I don't believe it's taking place in Texas today. We sure hope not.
So your bill is just because I mean, is it because you've seen it, how it works in other parts of the country and you don't like it?
Other parts of the country have found that it doesn't work very well. It confuses voters, discourages voters, and elects candidates who often were not the choice of the majority of the voters who voted. You know, Senator Secretary Cuellar, back in 2001, ruled this is not allowed under Texas law. But as you know, a Secretary of State's election opinion is an opinion. Doesn't have the force of law. And so there has been legislation filed this session to bring ranked choice voting at the city level and other places. So this is to make it clear that we don't do this in Texas.
And the only policy issue is that you feel that it might confuse voters if they don't understand how it works?
Senator, that's a big part of it. As you know, voter exhaustion is a problem in a number of cases. And when voters are asked to rank the candidates 1 through 3, 1 through 5, however many there are, as you know, oftentimes voters are not familiar with all the candidates in the race. They may know 1 or 2 or dislike all of them, but for this to work, a voter would have to know each of the candidates or know something about each of the candidates to make their choices. And again, evidence shows that about a third of voters, when they're put in a ranked choice voting situation, rather than ranking the candidates 1 through 5, however many there are, about a third of voters pick just one candidate and then cast their ballot. And of course, when that happens, once your candidate is eliminated, your vote doesn't count in the remaining round. So that part is not just, respectfully, that's not just an opinion. That's how it works. And so that's been the experience of other states and of cities and counties who have tried it.
Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. The motion is on suspension of the regular order of business. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores, Gutierrez.
20 ayes, 10 nays. The rule is suspended. Chair lays out on second reading Senate Bill 921. Secretary, read the caption.
Senate Bill 921, relating the determination of a majority vote in certain elections.
There's an amendment. The Secretary will read the amendment.
Floor amendment number 1 by Hughes.
We'll let it get to the back row. Senator Hughes, would you like to explain your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, as you can see, this changes a few words. The effect of this is to make clear that the ban on ranked choice voting with this amendment would apply to primary elections as well as general elections. So to be clear, this point of the bill as amended would be to completely outlaw ranked choice voting in Texas. And that's what the amendment does.
Senator Eckhart, for what purpose?
To ask questions of the author of the
Do you
amendment.
yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Is this an attempt to bootstrap Senate Bill 1705 into this bill?
Senator, I'm embarrassed. You'll have to refresh my memory on 1705.
The 1705 requires a primary for all elected parties and does away with a convention for the determination of their party's nominee.
Great question. No, Senator, this is unrelated to that. That's a great question. I hope we get to have a discussion about that, but this would not have that effect. Thank you for asking.
So what is the purpose of adding in or to receive a political party's nomination?
Senator, because of the way the language is added in the code, as you can see, one talks about public office, one talks about to receive a political party's nomination. You and I run in a primary, but of course, our political parties, they don't give us, the voters who vote for us in the primary aren't giving us the office. That happens in the general election. So this is to make clear whether it's a general or a primary that it applies. That's the idea behind the bill.
But you are aware, of course, that third party parties select their nominee often through a series of ballots in a convention process. And so is this an attempt to force them to hold primaries, thus making it cost prohibitive for them to survive?
So this bill would not affect the convention process for those parties that don't have a primary, but for those that do, they'd be affected by the bill. So selection at a convention by those parties you're describing wouldn't be affected by this bill. As you said, there's a bill on that, but this one does not affect them. And I thank you for flagging that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. The motion is on the amendment. Secretary will call the roll. Any objection? Hearing none. The amendment is adopted. You're recognized passage to engrossment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move passage to engrossment.
Any objection? Secretary will call the roll, actually, because there is some objection.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco.
20 ayes, 10 nays. The bill passes to engrossment and will hold there.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members.
Senator Colcourse, you're recognized on committee substitute for Senate Bill 384 to suspend the regular order of business.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I move to suspend the Senate's regular order of business and take up and consider at this time committee substitute to Senate Bill 384. Members, Senate Bill 384 ensures that patients are protected from unsafe medical practices by requiring an in-person dental examination to be conducted before the sale of clear aligners. In 2021, we passed House Bill 2056 with Senator Perry to allow teledentistry in Texas. When the rules were adopted in 2021, I worked with the Board of Dental Examiners, not just with one letter, but with two letters and several meetings, to ensure the standard of care would not be reduced. Unfortunately, for patients in Texas, receiving irreversible orthodontic procedure legislation was needed. Clear aligners are transparent medical devices that slowly shift a person's teeth, similar to braces. The Joint Commission, which certifies over 22,000 healthcare organizations in the United States, has provided guidance concerning the standard for informed consent, asserting that a consent form on its own is not adequate. And so, members, what this does is, in practice, it requires you to have your teeth x-rayed so that you know that you are able to have your teeth moved properly. And there's scads of information on it, and I could go into it for a long time, but I'll spare you of that and say that I am going to have a clarifying amendment to make sure that there is no steerage and make it very clear that this is a standard of care.
Senator Paxton, for what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. President. To ask the author a question.
Do you yield?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Kolkhorst, when I first looked at this bill, for whatever reason, I was leaning against it because I was looking at it kind of through the lens of the free market. And as I actually read the bill itself, though, it occurred to me that there was a parallel, it seemed to me, at least in my mind. In years past, the legislature actually has passed legislation based on the process which Texans purchase contact lenses. And so people were buying contact lenses online without seeing an ophthalmologist or eye doctor of any sort. And so I wondered, is the motivation for SB 384 similar to that?
It is, and thank you for bringing that up because, again, I actually wear contacts. I know many of us do, and thousands of people do. And certainly when you go to an optometrist or an ophthalmologist, you have your eyes checked and they can fit you for contacts, but they give you a prescription. And it doesn't mean that you have to buy your contacts from them. You can go anywhere that you want, but you have to have that prescription. And again, like what is your prescription for your eyes? I happen to be nearsighted. And so this is no different than that. And my clarifying amendment will say, once you get that okay, then you can go anywhere. You can order your clear lighters online. You can go to another provider. But I again think that this is a one step in the continuum. And let me say, Senator Paxton, I did not want to bring the legislation on this when the bill for teledentistry came through Health and Human. I voted for it. I just never dreamed that we wouldn't just at least have this step. And interestingly enough, on some of the affidavits that I've seen, you have to provide that, yes, I've had my teeth x-rayed, but there's no proof of that. And so, again, this is just making sure that we have a continuity of care that I think will be very good for our Texas patients. Very similar to your contacts.
In the same way, because folks were buying contacts directly online without any sort of a healthcare provider being involved in the process, and you're putting things in your eyes, right? I mean, and there's a real health and safety concern there. And I think as I read this, that's what I see for these types of things. You're moving teeth around, that has a health and safety impact on a patient that may last for years, right? And you just want to have a healthcare provider involved in that process and proof of it.
Absolutely. I grew up as the daughter of a dentist. I know all about this. Unfortunately, my children had very crooked teeth, and it was interesting that Jake had some anomalies of how his teeth could and couldn't be moved. And thank goodness we had great care, and they caught some things. Same with Lois Kate in an extraction of a tooth that she had to have before she could get her orthodontics. So orthodontia. So it is a standard of care that I think is good for our citizens. And again, not steering anyone to anything. Right. You can go and order them online all you want once it's been determined your roots are long enough, there's not an impacted wisdom tooth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I look forward to seeing the clarifying amendment because it really does protect the free market, but also the health and safety of the patient. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Members, the motion is on suspension of the regular order of business. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell.
23 ayes, 7 nays, rules suspended. Chair lays out second reading. Committee substitute for Senate Bill 384. Secretary, read the caption.
Committee substitute Senate Bill 384 relating the sale, design, and manufacture of clear aligners.
Members, there is an amendment. We'll let them get to the back row so you can read them. Secretary will read the amendment.
Floor amendment number 1 by Kolkhorst.
I think they all have it. You may explain it, Senator Kolkhorst.
Thank you, Mr. President. During the bill layout, I heard some concerns and took those into consideration, and I think the point was very well made. So, members, this amendment makes it crystal clear that the examination recommendation cannot steer a patient to a particular clear aligner. While the bill is designed to protect orthodontic patients before an irreversible procedure takes place. The amendment simply prevents a dentist from having a patient agree to a specific clear aligner treatment until after the examination has been conducted. The amendment also makes clear the dentist must provide records from the examination to other providers. This is very similar on how a patient would, as Senator Paxton said, get a prescription for contact lenses. With this amendment, Senate Bill 384 makes it clear that Texans can choose any aligner after an in-person exam.
Any objection? Hearing none. Amendment is adopted. You recognize passage to engrossment?
So moved, Mr. President.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Bencourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell.
23 ayes, 7 nays. The bill passed to engrossment. Senator, you're recognized on constitutional 3-day rule suspension.
I move suspension, Mr. President.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Bencourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton.
24 ayes, 6 nays. Constitutional 3-day rule is suspended. Chair now lays out in third reading and final passage committee substitute for Senate Bill 384. You're recognized on final passage. Secretary, read the caption.
Committee substitute Senate Bill 384 relating to the sale, design, and manufacture of clear aligners.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move final passage of committee substitute to Senate Bill 384.
Secretary, call the roll.
Alvarado, Bencourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell.
23 ayes, 7 nays. The bill is finally passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members.
Senator Betancourt, you recognize to suspend the regular order of business, Senate Bill 825.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. Under Section 212.028 of the Texas Election Code, a candidate desires to request a recount of the election. They must file an application to recount by 5 p.m. on the second day of the date after the canvass. The need for this bill became apparent when canvasses occurred on Tuesday of Thanksgiving week, which put the deadline on Thursday during Thanksgiving. During that scenario, candidates only had 1 day to file an application because obviously government wasn't open on the holiday. This would give candidates 1 more day to file an application, and if the deadline falls on a Friday or Sunday, or legal holiday, it moved to the next business day. And of course, this was something that happened in Harris County. With that, Mr. President, members, it moves suspension of the regular order of business to take up and consider Senate Bill 825.
Any objection? Hearing none. Rules are suspended. Chair lays out in second reading Senate Bill 825. Secretary, read the caption.
Senate Bill 825 relating to the deadline for submitting certain recount petitions.
You're recognized. Passage on engrossment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move passage of Senate Bill 825 to engrossment.
Any objection? Hearing none. Bill passed to engrossment. You're recognized to suspend the constitutional 3-day rule.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move suspend the constitutional rule that bills be read on 3 several days.
Secretary would call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell.
30 ayes, no nays. Rules suspended. Chair lays out third reading, final passage. Senate Bill 825. Secretary will read the caption.
Senate Bill 825 relating to the deadline for submitting certain recount petitions.
Now you're recognized to go.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move final passage of Senate Bill 825.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco.
30 ayes and no nays. The bill is passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of many.
Senator Hughes, you're recognized. Committee substitute for Senate Bill 747 to lift this thing off the ground here. Suspend the regular order of business.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend the Senate's regular order of business to take up and consider Senate Bill 747. Members, this has to do with what happens when there's a runoff election. Under current law, if a candidate, so let's say there's a primary and no one breaks 50%. So the top 2 go to a runoff. Under current law, if one of those top 2 withdraws before the runoff takes place, then the other candidate wins. The number 3 candidate does not move up for the runoff. And so depending on the circumstances, that can result in a candidate who got a relatively small percentage of the votes being the party's nominee. So Senate Bill 747 says if one candidate withdraws from the runoff by the 5th day after the deadline for the vote to be canvassed, that candidate is replaced on the runoff ballot. The ballot's changed to include the remaining runoff qualifier and the candidate who was in the number 3 position in the primary. Just lets voters get to choose which one they prefer. That's what the bill does, and I move suspension of the Senate's regular order of business.
Senator Springer, you're recognized.
President, ask a couple questions.
Do you yield?
To the author.
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you, Senator Hughes. In looking through this, I'm trying to figure out, a circumstance, and I remember my first session that came in that at that time Senator Glenn Hager was running against Representative Harvey Hildebrand, and Harvey missed it by just a handful, 100 votes or so, and then stepped out. So under this bill, would the third place person then take that spot, and we would have to have a runoff statewide?
Senator, that's exactly right. Now, in the situation you described, if the first and second place candidate wished to do the same thing, they would just need to wait for enough time to pass. Then that second place candidate who barely made the runoff could withdraw, and the number 1 candidate would be elected. But this is for that situation where the number 1 candidate barely misses 50%, 2 and 3 are much lower. Number 1 gets out, and then number 2, maybe just by a hair, becomes the nominee. But to your point, the number 1 and 2 candidates could still do that. They just have to wait a little bit before they've made that move.
Okay,
that's
so
a great point.
It doesn't force all those. This is only when that top candidate is then withdrawing.
That's exactly. I'm so glad you asked. It's triggered by the withdrawal of number 1 or 2.
I was sitting there thinking of all the money we saved by Representative Hildebrand stepping down in there, and I didn't want to think we were taking that away. But I also know of instances where the number 1 candidate barely also missed, and then all of a sudden decides he doesn't want to run. And somebody who had 25, 30% of the votes, a lot of votes, but still nowhere near a majority. So, all right, thank you for that clarification.
Senator, that's an important aspect of the bill, which I had not addressed, and thank you for that question, for laying it out.
Senator Hinojosa, what purpose?
Well, Senator Hughes yield for a couple of questions.
You yield.
Of course, I'll yield.
Senator Hughes, I guess we just a while ago passed a bill dealing with preferential voting systems.
Yes, sir.
Where you had people vote once, twice, 3 or 4, 5, 6 times to determine the winner. But in this situation, what you're doing is, and I don't necessarily agree, but you're allowing for a runoff from someone that came in third place. if the person who came in second place or the candidate who came in second place withdraws?
Senator, that's correct. You're right. It does do that. You're right.
Why?
Because the concern is that a candidate who got a very small percentage of the vote, nowhere close to a majority, could become the nominee. You know, if the number one candidate almost breaks 50%, then number 2 and 3 are down in the 20s, normally we'd have a runoff between number 1 and number 2. But if number 1 withdraws, then the number 2 candidate, who got 20-something% of the vote, they become the nominee. And they were not the first choice of a majority of the voters. So that's the idea, just for the runoff to have effect. That's the idea behind the bill.
Well, but the voters actually ranked the third candidate number 3. And now you're elevating that candidate to number 2. And I guess part of my concern is we also having a situation where we are adding additional costs to a lot of the local communities that really they wouldn't have to. I think there's another bill that deals with runoffs that wouldn't have to spend taxpayers' money in having a runoff when the voters decided who would be the number 1 candidate.
Well, I see what you mean. And in a normal situation, if no one breaks 50%, the top 2 go to a runoff, normally there's a runoff. It's pretty unusual for one of those two to withdraw after the primary but before the runoff. So this would only apply in that situation where no one breaks 50%, and then right after the primary, one of those people withdraws. So this is a pretty rare situation, but it could be an unjust result if we didn't make this adjustment.
Well, it seems to me that way you are sort of reassigning the votes from the second candidate who came in second to a third candidate to push that candidate to a runoff. I mean, I just see a conflicting legislation, and the one you passed earlier today in Senate Bill 921.
Yes, sir.
All of a sudden, you're going back and adding additional qualifications, or at least seems to be reassigning votes to what the voters decided. But thank you for answering my questions.
No, thank you, Senator. Thanks for your questions.
Senator Betancourt, what purpose?
Ask questions of the author.
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Senator, can we take time to make sure we understand what we've got here? Because if following Senator Hinojosa's line of reasoning, we might want to take some time and slow the bill down so we can visit with everyone about what this means. You've got an automatic promotion from third place to second, even though we're eliminating ranked choice voting.
So ranked choice voting, that's correct. Ranked choice voting, of course, is not contemplated by the current election code. That's a separate animal. The bill before us has to do with a runoff, which most of us are familiar with. In the primary, if no candidate gets over 50%, the top 2 candidates go to a runoff. And that's a runoff where the voters get to show up and actually vote. It has nothing to do with ranked choice voting. This is the current system for runoff elections in the primary.
Right.
And so under the current system, if the number 1 candidate gets 49% of the vote, second and third each are in the 20s, then the top 2 go to a runoff. The one that got 49 and the one that got the higher of 2 and 3. If, however, when that happens after the primary, before the runoff, early in the process, if that number 1 candidate withdraws, the guy or gal that got 49%, they withdraw. Now the number 2 candidate who got in the 20s under current law, they become the nominee. There is no runoff. So this law says if one of those top 2 withdraw, number 3 gets to move up, so the voters get to choose and vote in the runoff. That's what the bill does.
Okay,
this has nothing to do with ranked choice voting.
Okay, so a withdrawal during the election period when the ballots are already printed?
No, sir.
Okay.
As the bill says, the withdrawal has to take place by the 5th day after the deadline for the vote to be canvassed, so very early in the process. Once the runoff is set, the ballots are printed, If somebody withdraws, that happens. When it happens early in the process, that's when this would come into play.
So what period of time is it applicable?
Until the 5th day after the deadline for the vote to be canvassed. As you know, the county is given a certain range to canvass the vote. So rather than put a certain number of days, it has to be after the 5th day for the deadline for the vote to be canvassed. So very early in the process.
Okay, so, but wait a minute, I'm trying to understand. Early in the process is not the 5th day after the canvass. Okay, all right? Because once you've canvassed the votes, you've got already a result. So when would the person have withdrawn if they're already on the ballot and been declared a winner?
They have to withdraw by the 5th day after the deadline for the vote to be canvassed. If they withdraw after that, they're on the ballot, and just like it is today.
Okay, so in an election process, we've got a race where there's multiple candidates. So let's assume this is a primary.
It only applies to a primary.
Right, okay. Because it could happen in a general, but it's less statistically likely.
Well, no, so no, sir, in a general.
Right, because there's generally no runoff.
Let me answer your question. Right. In a general, you don't need 50% plus 1. The highest vote getter wins. In a primary, you got to have over 50%.
All right, so you're in a primary, and then so 5 days after the canvass, somebody can basically withdraw at that point, and then even though that person would have already won, that's what I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand, this is like I'm trying to understand what the post facto element of this is. If somebody is on the ballot, they didn't withdraw before the election, they're in the election.
So, Senator, the primary takes place. Nobody gets 50%. So the top 2 go to runoff.
Right.
So far, so good, right?
Right.
Top 2 go to a runoff. That's done. If, after that primary takes place, but within 5 days of the canvassing, if that number 1 candidate, who got almost 50%, if they withdraw, under current law, that number 2 candidate wins. If this bill passes, if the number 1 candidate or the number 2 withdraws in that first part, then the number 3 candidate can step in and the voters still get to choose in a runoff. Otherwise, the number 2 candidate automatically wins.
Okay, so we're outside we're in a canvass period, which is 10 days past the election. And we have a situation where 2 candidates were going to go into a runoff, and that the first candidate decides then to withdraw.
Either one of those candidates withdraws, that's right.
That the third place person is automatically promoted into, instead of a winner being declared between the 2, one that withdrew, we're now setting up an additional election process.
There was already a runoff scheduled, Senator. We are changing the people who'd be in the runoff. That's right.
So basically, so right now, if one of the 2 withdrew, the other one is elected, true?
Exactly right. That's right.
And was there an incident, a specific example that occurred that got us to this point? I'm just trying to understand.
Well, Senator, it's a question of having a candidate who got a relatively small number of votes being chosen as the winner of the primary because the people on the ballot changed. That's the idea.
So this was somebody so there was an incident where somebody was at 48 or 49% of the vote and they withdrew, and then someone that had the plurality of the remainder was declared the winner, which could have been at 25%, pick a number, right?
Yes, sir. That's the idea. This doesn't happen very often. As you know, runoffs and primaries are fairly common. It's not common for one of the candidates to withdraw, but when they do, you can have this result for one who got a very small percentage of votes becomes the nominee.
Okay,
and the voters don't get to choose between 2 and 3.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Huffman, for what purpose?
I'm still trying to, maybe I'm slow, but I'm still trying to understand. So may I question the author?
Do you yield?
Of course I yield.
Yes, okay. So I know you've explained this about 3 times, but I'm trying to understand, to Senator Hinojos's questioning, how this differs a lot from the other type of voting that we don't like. So because it seems to me the voters would have spoken, right? And with someone, and your example was 49% or something. I guess it could be slightly different from that as well.
Right.
And so what is the advantage then of allowing the third place individual then to rise up? I mean, what's the advantage?
So, Senator, if you and Senator Parker and I are in a race and you get 49%, and then I get 25%, and he gets 24%.
Right.
Under current law, after that primary that's the primary election
Right,
we're all
I
about.
do understand that,
So after
yeah.
that election, if that takes place, if you for some reason withdraw right after the primary, there's not, normally you and I'd go to a runoff. But if you withdraw, then you're out, and then the second place candidate is declared the winner. There is no runoff. So the candidate that got 25% of the vote becomes a nominee. It's that result we described in the last bill, where someone who was not the first choice of a majority of the candidates becomes the winner. So that's what this is about. So normally when nobody wins the primary and no one gets 50%, there's a runoff.
Right.
I think people expect that. But if that number one candidate withdraws, then most folks assume 2 and 3 would go up and have a runoff. That's what this bill would do. Because under current law, 2 and 3 don't have a runoff. Number 2 is just declared the winner with no runoff election. That's the idea.
And to
That's the situation we're describing.
Yeah, and to Senator Betancourt's question, I think he was trying to ascertain, like, what was the impetus for this bill? I mean, was there a specific situation or an election where there was an issue that this was a problem?
Yes, there was testimony before the committee about this happening. And again, it's not about what particular candidate won or lost. Sure. The changes we make today will have no effect on election going backwards. But a number of voters were flummoxed. They said, well, there's not going to be, I thought 2 and 3 would move up and we'd have a runoff between number 2 and 3. And so voters were confused, they were angry, so they called their senators, and that's where this came from.
I wonder if a situation like this, though, could lend itself to some type of coercive activity where, you know, the top vote getter, not the majority vote getter, would be kind of somehow forced off the ballot to give an opportunity for someone lower on the ballot to rise up. I mean, I just have problems with the concept of this.
Well, as Senator Springer mentioned, we've had situations in the past, unrelated to this bill, where in the primary someone almost breaks 50%, and the second place candidate is way down. And the second place candidate chooses to withdraw to save having to go through the process. So, you know, candidates are always free to do that. And under the current law, that second place candidate can withdraw, or the first place candidate can withdraw. I would argue this: the current law is much more prone to being jimmied or messed with than the law would be under this bill.
I just found it would be highly unusual for a first place candidate to withdraw.
It is.
Anyway, okay. I have some concerns, but thank you for the explanation.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Senator Springer, hold on one moment. For what purpose?
To ask a follow-up question to my other question.
To ask Senator Hughes a question?
Yes.
Do you yield?
Of course I'll yield.
Senator, I appreciate it. You spent a ton of time in state affairs, chairing in elections, and you know a lot more about this than I do. But as I look through the bill, and I know I used my example, that, you know, that the second place drops out that's substantially further behind than somebody who's close. But that would mean the third place person would then come up to run against that. And I guess I'm looking at it and says, okay, that race had 3 people, but sometimes you have these races that has 10 people in there. And the first place one gets 49%. Second place may get 8. The next one may get 7. And they said, you know, we just want to, you know, I know I don't have a chance. I'm going to go back to work, do everything else, withdraw. I get the understanding of the guy who's in first stepping out, but I'm not sure that I understand why that person who steps out in second, sometimes they may just feel like, hey, you know, I'm in this small county. I know what it's going to cost to have an election. I don't want to put that on my taxpayers, my friends, my neighbors, and they withdraw. And then if we put the third place and says there has to be an election, they get forced to hold an election they wouldn't have held otherwise. And I don't know if, you know, possibly we would amend it or look at it that says the bill deals with that the first place steps out rather than the second place, or somebody below a certain threshold, potentially. But help me understand why that's not. I mean, because I can only think of, well, here recently there's one issue I can think of where the first place person stepped out, but a much more common situation is that second place one who's way behind steps out and decides. And of course, it's their right. That being said, I had 32% in the House and my opponent had 49. I decided to run and was victorious.
I understand.
those are the greater days. But
Well, great question. Let me answer your question by saying this. Neither situation is common, where the second place or the third place or the fourth place. It's fairly uncommon once a runoff is set for someone to withdraw. But when that does happen, under this bill, in the situation you described, you got almost 49% and I got 2% and I'm second place. If I wanted to withdraw and make you the winner instead of save the voters the expense of a runoff, all I've got to do is wait till the 5th day after the canvass deadline. Number 2 withdraws after that date, and number 1 is declared the winner, or vice versa. Number 1 withdraws. It's all about the timing. This bill just says if the withdrawal takes place before the 5th day after the 5th day after the canvass deadline.
so if their intent is to save their neighbors and taxpayers money, they just have to wait till the 5th day to be able to take their name off.
Exactly right. They withdraw then, and then nothing changes. Because obviously, if we wait too long, as Senator Betancourt noted, the ballot's got to be set, ballots have to be printed and mailed out, all that.
The ballot would be set in here to understand it. But okay, that does. I appreciate you helping to educate me on.
No, thank you for your questions. This is important. Thank you for your questions. Everybody here's been through an election or two, and so this is relevant, and we know what these experiences are like.
You have been recognized on suspension. Senator Hughes, for what purpose?
Mr. President, given the discussions going on among members of the Senate and getting comfortable with this process, which is pretty unusual, I withdraw my motion to suspend and look forward to bringing this back up in a day or so when we've had some time to discuss it further.
Thank you. The motion is to withdraw committee substitute for Senate Bill 747. I said get this thing off the ground, Brian. Senator Hughes, I said get this 747 off the ground. You didn't quite... You didn't get off the taxiway.
It was almost like some of those other 747s in the movies. So it's a good thing you advised us like you did. Thank you.
Yes, we're looking out for you, pilot.
Thank you.
Members, the motion is to withdraw any objection. Motion is withdrawn. Motion is adopted. So your motion is withdrawn, Senator, just so you know. Senator Zaffarini, you're recognized as a committee substitute for Senate Bill 380.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President and members, I move to suspend the Senate's regular order of business to take up and consider at this time the committee substitute for Senate Bill 380, which was recommended for the local and uncontested calendar. It relates to payment of certain court costs associated with interpreters. Members, to enhance access to justice for litigants with limited English proficiency, federal law requires state courts that receive federal assistance to appoint interpreters free to those who need them. What's more, state law requires the appointment of an interpreter for anyone who needs it, and Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 145 stipulates that court-appointed professionals are a covered court cost for those with a valid statement of inability to pay on file. To cover this cost in Texas, the legislature established a $3 fee for this purpose to be paid with all civil filings. Despite federal and state laws in Rule 145, however, some low-income litigants and legal aid providers are being required to pay for language access services, such as interpreters, at their own expense. This makes their access to justice impossible. Generally, then, the committee substitute for Senate Bill 380 would clarify that a party who files a statement of inability to afford payment of court costs is not required to pay for an interpreter unless the statement has been contested in court and the party has been ordered to pay according to Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 145. There is a floor amendment by Senator Perry that addresses his concerns and that he will explain.
Senator Zaffarini moves suspension of the regular order of business on committee substitute 380. Is there an objection? Hearing none, the rules are suspended. The chair lays out on second reading committee substitute for Senate Bill 380. The secretary will read the caption.
Committee substitute, Senate Bill 380, relating to payment of certain court costs associated with interpreters.
Following an amendment, clerk will read the amendment. Secretary will read the amendment.
Floor amendment number 1 by Perry.
Senator Perry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this amendment will require county auditors in consultation with the district county clerks to submit data to the Office of Court Administration regarding the number of interpreters that are appointed and the amount of money county spends on appointed interpreters. Reporting will apply to both civil and criminal cases. The Office of Court Administration will then compile the data, submit a report to the legislature outlining how much the counties are spending on the appointing interpreters. I believe the amendment is accepted to offer. Members, I think that the criminal aspect of this is already required. I'm told that we already have fees built into the structure to pay for those interpreters, but it would be, I think, valuable information to know how many people are accessing those court interpreters in the next legislative session.
Senator Zaffarini on the amendment, you're recognized.
It is acceptable to the author, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Perry.
Thank you.
Is there objection to the adoption of the amendment? Hearing none, amendment is adopted. Senator Zaffarini is recognized for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move passage to engrossment.
Senator Zaffarini moves passage to engrossment. Is there objection? Hearing none. Senator Zaffarini is recognized for a motion to suspend the constitutional 3-day rule.
Thank you, Mr. President. So moved.
Senator Zaffarini moves suspension of the 3-day rule. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores, Gutierrez, Hall, Hancock, and Huffman.
There will be 26 yeas and 4 nays. The rules are suspended. Chair lays out on third reading and final passage of Committee Substitute for Senate Bill 380. Secretary, read the caption.
Committee Substitute Senate Bill 380 relating to payment of certain court costs associated with interpreters.
Senator Zaffarini is recognized for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move final passage.
Senator Zaffarini moves final passage of Committee Substitute for Senate Bill 380. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores, Gutierrez, Hall.
There'll be 26 yeas and 4 nays. The bill is finally passed. Congratulations, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President and members, and Senator Perry.
Chair announces the signing of the following in the presence of the Senate.
House Concurrent Resolution Number 70.
The President's desk is clear. Are there any announcements? Chair recognizes Senator Hughes for an announcement.
Thank you, Mr. President. A very simple, straightforward announcement. The Senate Committee on State Affairs will reconvene in the Senate chamber at 4:15 p.m. this afternoon. 4:15.
Are there any other announcements?
The chair recognizes the Dean of the Senate for a highly privileged motion.
Mr. President, members, before what are we going to do? Adjourn today? We can either recess or adjourn. Today it's adjourned. Members, we'll have a short caucus to go over our schedule immediately upon adjournment. With that, Mr. President, I move that the Senate adjourn until 11 a.m. Tuesday, March 25th.
Members, I would ask if I could have your attention before I adjourn this and we go into the caucus. I'd like to have a moment of silence for the families who lost their children and their spouses in Tennessee in the school shooting today. If we could have a moment of silence. Thank you, members. The chair hears no objection to the dean's motion. The Senate stands adjourned until 11 a.m. Tuesday, March 28th. And if you'll all come right back, we'll be quick and let you get on to your committees. Thank you.